by 25 atheists. My first claim, atheists reject God, but they don't understand what they're rejecting.
Jordan Peterson is a successful clinical and evolutionary psychologist who made his fame by transforming himself into a conservative talking head who saw in even the most moderate calls for progressive reform a postmodern neo-Marxist plot to rebuild the Gulag, and acted as a surrogate father for confused young men. His 15 minutes of fame are largely gone. We are around a decade out from when Peterson was being referred to as the most influential public intellectual in the West. However, Jubilee, a platform that produces content around public disagreement and cultural war issues, invited Peterson to debate a room full of atheists. Watching this video convinced me that Peterson is an atheist himself. Peterson often invokes so-called Judeo-Christian values as the ethical foundation of Western civilization. He uses metaphorical readings of biblical stories to offer a conservative view of the human condition in which capitalist democracy results from natural hierarchies of competence and not the struggle between oppressor and oppressed. Thus, it is those attempts to transform the social order in a less hierarchical direction which produce corrupt hierarchies of power, rather than a more egalitarian world. For Peterson, historical communism is the biggest demonstration of the truth of this analysis, where to abolish the hierarchy of competence that privileged capitalists over workers, communists had to destroy society in a fit of mass murder and slavery. Thus, for Peterson, the Judeo-Christian faith is a narrative of the human condition which puts personal responsibility above projects of social transformation, arguing that in order to achieve ultimate purpose, human beings have to get their own house in order on an individual basis before demanding social change, and thus to accept hierarchies of competence which not only pervade human society but pervade nature. This conservative anthropology is for Peterson the point of the stories of original sin, the story of Cain and Abel, and the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Adam and Eve caused the fall of humanity by privileging their own momentary desires over long-term stable interests. Cain let his resentment for his competent brother lead him to commit an act of murder, and Christ's sacrifice represents the need for responsibly sacrificing one's own immediate interest for more meaningful long-term goals. In this way, the biblical tales are metaphorical expressions of deep social truths about the need for human beings to prioritize individual responsibility and competence over lofty utopian goals. Thus, the closest thing to an unforgivable sin against the Holy Ghost for Peterson is the hubris he thinks is required to imagine the 21st century neo-Marxists could somehow pull off communism with better results than the entire 20th century communist experiment. To do so is to imagine that you have figured out what every Marxist before you had failed to, demonstrating a lack of self-awareness and thus failing to take personal responsibility. The main point of tension throughout the discussion in the Jubilee video is whether Peterson is actually a Christian who believes in the metaphysical truths of Christian theology. Peterson himself refused to say. As he explains, God and worship of God, in his view, are the ultimate flourishing of human beings and the recognition by human beings of the values that promote this flourishing, which for Peterson are hierarchies of competence and personal responsibility, respectively. He says the metaphysical truths of Christian theology, for instance, the existence of a supernatural reality and a material God, are entirely besides the point. For Peterson, atheism is thus only possible as a nihilistic rejection of all ultimate value, a view which human beings, even professing atheists, can't live out consistently. Peterson rightly identifies himself as a pragmatist. Pragmatism was a 20th century movement in American philosophy which emphasized social and scientific utility over philosophical attempts to know my independent or fundamental reality. Peterson identifies in particular with the pragmatism of William James, who used pragmatism to justify faith in spiritual experience. However, his approach has more in common with the hard-nosed pragmatism of C.S. Peirce, who argued that philosophy should focus on the development of practical consensus among the scientific community. This is because, unlike James, Peterson's pragmatism puts aside the question of transcendent reality, as does the pragmatism of Peirce. Peterson does this by reducing philosophical questions to questions about the results of human and animal action in producing hierarchies of competence or power. Peterson's view of religion thus naturalizes religious subject matter and makes them into strategies for interaction with the material social world and natural environment. Whatever one might say about pragmatism, it has some problems maintaining self-consistency at the systematic level. One could ask Peirce how he knows that philosophy should be about scientific consensus. He may reply that scientific consensus provides social utility by allowing human beings to fortuitously interact with nature. However, to justify the value of this kind of utility, we need a theory of human beings, a theory of nature, and a theory of value that answers more traditional philosophical questions about the nature of the world, if not my independent reality. In other words, pragmatism has a tendency to skew theory for practice in a way that undercuts practice itself. It is for this reason that even if pragmatism influenced subsequent philosophy, philosophers from both the continental and analytic traditions have refused to observe its injunction to stop worrying about the fundamental nature of the world. This contradiction manifests itself in Petersonian pragmatism about both politics and religion. In the political realm, Peterson's narrow focus on utility has led him to under-theorize his notion of hierarchy in his comparison of capitalist democracy to communism. Peterson fails to define his notion of hierarchy because he is more interested in anachronistic comparisons of human hierarchies to animal hierarchy and lamenting the terrors and errors of historical communism than in actually investigating the social basis of hierarchical social institutions. And so Peterson doesn't actually have any way to principally distinguish between meritocratic competence hierarchies and corrupt power hierarchies. Thus, Peterson merely assumes that democratic capitalist hierarchies are justified and merely insists that radical egalitarian visions of social organization always lead to the Gulag. It would be an unforgivable sin by his lights to ask the question of whether the Soviet exported Stalinist model of communism is the only possible one, and thus he leaves himself open to the exact same charge he levels against the Marxists. Capitalist democracy has a body count which is comparable to historical communism, in fact, a body count much more extensive. When one adds up the global genocide and continuing marginalization of indigenous people, the miseries of third world poverty, the over-policing of and underinvestment in communities of color in liberal democracies like the United States, and growing world-scale inequality, the list of victims simply dwarfs the dead under every communist regime to ever exist. If Peterson were to recognize this pile of bodies and try to theorize what went wrong and how the project of capitalist democracy could be renewed to avoid these failures, he would be committing what his pragmatism labels an unforgivable sin. In religion, Peterson has done the opposite of what he set out to do. He set out to enter into the debate over religion on its side, the debate on the existence of God on the side of theism, but he has forsaken the substance of both in his attempt. The point of every religion in the history of mankind has been to relate human beings to a supersensory and material reality. By the lights of religion, the purpose of human life is relating to this reality in the proper way. God is thus the ultimate being of the supernatural realm who accounts for the existence of everything in heaven and earth but God's self. However, Peterson's conservative anthropology ironically removes this realm and thus God from the human picture. Peterson is thus a partisan of atheism, not theism. He is at best a partisan of the kind of mock humanistic religion that opponents of religion have tried in vain to create, not religion in the real sense. Peterson, to paraphrase G.W. of Hegel, can never mean what he says or say what he means. He can't justify his most sacred principles. He in fact justifies their rejection. His faith is not a faith at all in the religious sense. It's a confused attempt at a secular religion designed for the culture war against anyone who wants to upend the status quo for a more just future. It's pop conservatism, a boring charade.
Miller, how do
deep.
they regard Mary?
Why are you asking me that?
Because you're a Christian.
You say that. I haven't claimed that.
Oh, what is this? Is this Christians versus atheists?
I don't know.
You don't know where you are right now.
Don't be a smartass.
Well,
and I mean
either you're a Christian or you're not.
I won't talk to you if you're a smartass.
Oh, either you're a Christian or you're not. Which one is it?
I could be either of them, but I don't have to tell you.
You don't have to tell me. I was under the impression I was invited to talk to a Christian. Am I not talking to a Christian?
No, you were invited to.
I think everyone should look at the title of the YouTube channel. You're probably in the wrong YouTube video.
You're really quite something, you are.
Aren't I? But you're really quite nothing, right? You're not a Christian.
Okay, I'm done with him.